development, and manufacturing in chemical, pharmaceutical, aerospace, and defense industries. He has developed programs, tools, methodologies that integrated sustainability, green chemistry, and green technology into existing business processes. I invite you, Dr. David Constable, to please begin the session. We also have question and answer session in the end, so please do put your queries in the chat box. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, everybody, for the very kind introduction. Sakshi, thank you for the invitation to speak with you today. I mentioned to Sakshi that I've been to India 7 times and have developed some great relationships with many people in India, and it's always a pleasure to be there and I love your food and really enjoy the collegiality and welcome that I always receive. Today, I'd like to talk to you about things that are really a bit broader than just the kinds of green sustainable chemistry that perhaps you have heard. I don't know to what extent you're taught about this. So I'm going to be taking a very deep dive, and I'm also going to be talking very quickly because I have a lot of slides to cover. So hopefully, there we go. Just a little bit about our institute. So we are a small staff function of the ACS. There's 5 of us. And what we do, I'll draw your attention to this tagline here, engaging you to reimagine chemistry and engineering for a sustainable future. And there's 3 parts to that. The first is you. And I truly mean you. It's students and people that are young, in my opinion, that will be turning things over to and expecting you to reimagine chemistry. The reason I say reimagine will become clearer in the subsequent slides, but basically the way in which chemistry is practiced today is completely unsustainable. So we need to really change that. And what our group does is really try to advance the science around green sustainable chemistry. We advocate for education, and we actually are trying to develop educational modules for educational purposes. And we also have a very close association with industry. I personally spent 17.5 years in the pharmaceutical industry, promoting and developing green and sustainable chemistry and engineering programs within the pharma industry. I'm going to be talking about some big risks, some challenges, and the importance of design. So one of the key takeaways here is that we've got real problems in the world. I know you know that. The challenges are inherent to the way in which chemistry is practiced. And the only way that we're going to dig ourselves out of the hole that we're in is to design our way out of it, to really be mindful in how we design our chemistries and our chemical processes. I use this quote often and ask people to think about the fact that as scientists and engineers, we are trained to be analytical and to ask questions. The problem has been that we basically find the answers to the wrong question. We're not asking the right questions. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is really to try and to get you to think about asking the right questions. So why do I say reimagine chemistry? As I said, it's completely unsustainable. No matter where you look throughout the world, chemistry is being done. And chemistry, the way it's being done, it cannot be sustained much longer the way it is being carried out now, and many reasons for that. I also believe that chemists and engineers, chemical engineers, are really uniquely equipped to do something about making the world more sustainable. So these are all the places that chemists play a role. First is in feedstock. And one of the things about pharmaceuticals, which people rarely think about, is everything is based on oil. Almost everything, except for the large molecules that have been developed recently. But for the past 70 or so years, all pharmaceuticals predominantly, overwhelmingly, have been based on oil or fossil carbon feedstocks. So we need to think about how we can change our feedstocks. the chemicals, the chemistries, and the processes that we use to affect chemical transformations of the molecules. So we start out with our reactants. The chemicals, chemistries, and processes are all inherently based on unsustainable, mainly non-renewable materials and practices. This is really the problem at a big level. We consume massive amounts of natural resources. We produce a relatively small amount of goods and services. And if you look at this from a macroeconomic scale, over 95% of what we produce in any given month, it ends up as waste in a landfill. So a couple caveats about green sustainable chemistry. It's not environmental chemistry, all right? Although environmental chemistry helps you to be a better designer as a chemist. It's not just waste minimization or pollution prevention. Many people focus throughout the world on the pollution prevention aspect, or should I say the waste aspects of chemistry. And what you need to do in green sustainable chemistry to be effective is to switch the model from the back end and treating wastes, or accepting the fact that we are going to produce a lot of waste, and say, how can I create things that have used less waste and less energy, not only in their making, but also through their use and through their end of life. And finally, it's not recycling and reuse. Although as we think about circularity or moving towards a more circular economy, certainly recycling and reuse will have a big role to play. Just a fact that right now throughout the world, less than 8% of what we make is recycled. So there's some big drivers, and I often try and get people to think about that you all come into this room or this discussion with a particular worldview. You are raised a certain way, you have certain filters that you view the world through, and all of us have them. And so I like to talk through some of the filters or my filters and prompt you a little bit to think about yours. So how do you view the world? Well, do you view it as though there's plenty of resources, or do we have finite and diminishing resources? And what I come from is that we are actually experiencing a period of finite and diminishing resources. And this is a tremendous problem, which most people don't really grasp. Another one that, you know, in science we generally don't talk about, but people are the main drivers of this, you know, diminishing resources, right? The humans have developed a tremendous capacity and are basically using a tremendous number of resources. So if we continue to increase population, we're going to continue to accelerate the rate at which we are using resources. There's just no way around it. And so I would argue that we really do need to get a handle on the world's population. It's a world's problem. It isn't just any country's problem. It's a world problem. The environment will take care of itself versus the environment is stressed. And you know, we have treated the environment, the world, as a big sink or a big waste dump. We use its services regularly for everything that we need. And then when we're done with those things, we dump things into our land or into our ocean or into our air as though the environment can handle it forever. And what I would argue, from my perspective, the environment is highly stressed, and it's not going. In my opinion, it's also in many places reached a tipping point. That is, that environmental degradation is going to have serious impacts in the not too distant future. And the other thing that we all basically take as a given is life will continue on pretty much as it always has. So we go through life, we all do, you know, we get up, we go through our same routines every day, and we expect that we will be able to continue those things on and on. You know, the recent year, the past year with the COVID has really changed our perception of that, right? We can see that how something as simple as, you know, a microscopic virus can actually impact the world. Prior to 2019, how many people would really think about that? You know, so I would say that that kind of disruptive change, either from pandemics or from geopolitical issues, is likely to accelerate. In other words, the rate at which these kind of big issues happen is going to accelerate. Again, it's a product of the fact that there's lots of people in the world. This is where we get most of our resources to make what we make. Not going to spend a lot of time on it, but this is the feedstock feed chain that we all rely on. And it's basically fossil carbon, mainly for chemicals, for oil and natural gas, right? We don't rely too much on coal except for energy. And the chemical industry is a major energy user. For distillation processes alone. So in pharma, we use batch chemical processes. We use a lot of solvent switching. We distill. It is a fact that the world or the chemical industry accounts for 12% of the global energy use. Distillation alone in the chemical processing industry accounts for 12% of the energy use. Now think about that for a moment. That's more than what the airline industry impacts in terms of energy use and CO2 production. The supply of critical elements is not sustainable. So this is something that almost no one thinks about. This is our palette of materials. This is our building blocks. And as chemists, you know this periodic table very well. What you may not have seen before, or maybe you have, is that a number of these elements that we rely on very intimately are highly stressed. So I'll point your attention to the middle here in the transition metals and what I call the platinum group metals, or others call precious metals. But think about all of the catalytic reactions that have happened and over the past 20 years, and all the development that has happened with elements like palladium, platinum, rhodium, iridium, ruthenium. These are all highly stressed elements. Another way to think about it is go over to the right here on the periodic table and you see indium, gallium, germanium, arsenic, tin. These are all elements used tremendously in electronics. All of you have calculators or have cell phones and computers and so on and so forth. Every one of them relies on these elements. And again, they are all highly stressed. So it's a tremendous issue. So this slide is just showing that the impact of supply restriction and supply risk, you look in the upper right-hand corner, and this just goes to show you that the materials like the palladium, the platinum, and the rhodium, very susceptible to supply risk and very supply restriction. So this gets into geopolitics because these elements come from certain regions in the world. And supply risk is also because of the supply chain associated with it and also where they come from in the world. So this is a huge issue that is sort of underlying your life, but most people don't ever think about where things come from. Most people also don't understand about metals industry and where metals come from. And so what this slide is showing is that, you know, I may be mining for copper, but I get all these other materials, you know, so platinum group metals, I get rhenium from molybdenum, and tin, I get indium. Platinum here, platinum group metals. If I go for nickel, I get some platinum group metals and copper and gold. Over here in zinc, I get indium. I have indium circled because it's such a highly stressed element. It's in virtually every touch screen. It's in virtually every photovoltaic array. It's a dopant for silicon chips at the 10 part per million level. Talk more about it in just a minute. So you say, well, zinc, you know, look at the chemicals used as zinc, it's only 6%. The point is that all these other uses of zinc are going to interfere with our ability to use zinc in chemicals. And we do use zinc in chemistry. Think about it about tin. Something like 40% of the reactions still of small drug molecules on the market in commercial use use tin as a catalyst in some part of their synthetic route. So tin is extremely important, but look at the problems in terms of abundance and the reserves that we have in the world, the known reserves, and look at it in terms of the negative social and environmental impacts. Mining means people. Mining is done in certain locations in the world. In this case, there's a lot of tin in the Indonesian island of Bangka, and Bangka mining is extremely dangerous. And there's this huge amount of issues in terms of organotin. So one of the things that you have to always think about in transition metals is what happens to them when they're released to the environment. Tin is very easily mobilized in the environment. It becomes organotin, and organotin compounds, as you hopefully know, are exquisitely toxic to environmental organisms and to people. Back to indium. And the point I was saying here, demand is rising sharply because it's in everything. And, you know, in this lower right-hand panel here, you see a silicon voltaic array. And the point I make here is that when we make photovoltaic cells and we use indium as a dopant, we do it in 10%, or 10 parts per million. We will never get that 10 ppm back. Right? If we reprocess the silicon to get the silicon, it's very unlikely we'll be able to get the indium back. This is what's known as entropic distribution. And virtually everything that you do as chemists in terms of when you use a metal, you are contributing to entropic distribution. So think about it. The palladium that you use as a catalyst to do a reduction, palladium on carbon, right? Okay, you say, well, I recycle it. I use a filter cake and I recycle it. Well, actually, you leave some. You leave 5 to 10% of the palladium on carbon in that filter cake, and that filter cake is gotten rid of. And that 5 to 10% of the palladium is never recovered. So the point is that you can never get, you know, thermodynamics and entropy, you'll never escape. And this is what the problem is that people don't really believe. So I could go on and on. Rhodium is the same kind of thing. The socioeconomic costs, where these things come from. So the platinum group metals or precious metals are mined largely in 2 places in the world, in South Africa and in Russia. In South Africa in 2012, there was a lot of unrest. Point being, people were killed striking for living wages and better work conditions. And 50,000 of them were let go because they were striking. So think of the impacts that that has on a local and regional level. So what happened? It switched the market to what's known as artisanal mining. And artisanal mining is small clan-led mining operations. Many of them central nervous system toxicant. And it is responsible for birth defects and all kinds of issues like that. So this is the consequence of our need to go precious metals. I go crazy when I hear people working with iridium. And the reason I go crazy about iridium is the only place we will restock iridium is by meteorites. That's where iridium comes from. If you look at where iridium is mined in the South Africa, it is the site of the KT extinction event. That is, a meteorite hit the earth, and that's how we got our iridium in South Africa. That extinction event, 99% of life was destroyed on Earth. So again, iridium should be treated as more than a precious metal. It is exquisitely rare element. And this is another example of the environmental devastation associated with a thing as gold. This is in South America. And just you can see that they have taken an extremely verdant environment and converted it into a toxic wasteland. And this was all done by criminal elements in the area who went into national parks in those areas. They go in and you can see all this infrastructure is abandoned when they're finally shut down. And so this becomes a hazardous waste site because of all the heavy metals. So this face of the earth, we're not going to get them eventually. And so it will drive us towards asteroid mining. And lest you think that this is science fiction, it's not. There are companies that are already organizing and thinking about mining asteroids. And this is the reason why. There's all of these elements at the bottom that you can get by mining asteroids. This was published in 2019 in May. And this is their, this was done in England for the European Commission. And this was just looking at the likelihood and the time scale. So it's going to happen likely in your lifetimes. I'll be dead and buried, but it's going to happen in your lifetime. So green and sustainable chemistry is something that a lot of people have believed has had a lot of activity and effort. And I have noticed for many years that while there is a lot of academic activity in green and sustainable chemistry, that activity and those innovations have not been translated very much into industrial practice. And so I did a patent search, and I've done it in the US and I've done it throughout the world. And the basic trends that you see on this chart hold through. This was done from 1990 to the end of 2019. And you can see this is the number of patents in the US that are related to green and sustainable chemistry. This comes out of a patent set of 10 million or more patents, okay? And what it showed is that over that 30-year period, less than somewhere between, well, let's say an average of about 1.2% of patents that were done in the US or created were actually related to green sustainable chemistry. And just a very interesting factoid is that the second largest patent holder for green sustainable patents in the United States was India. And the largest organization responsible for that was the CSIR. Phosphorus is another example. We use phosphorus intensively in pharma for a variety of reasons, everything from buffers to salts of our final drug substances, so on and so forth. This is just a quick slide to say phosphorus is critical to life. It's critical to chemistry. It's critical to the way we know it. Again, few places it's mined. China, the Morocco and Western Sahara are the two biggest world suppliers of phosphorus. When you think about those regions and the geopolitical issues associated with them, you say, is phosphorus supply truly stable? And many people look at phosphorus and the increase in demand, and they look at how, or like oil, it's going to peak at some point in the future. So not going to spend a lot of time, but one message I want to leave you with is the idea about these problems of thinking through green and sustainable chemistry solutions require you to think at a systems level. So a lot of what I've been talking to you today is a very big level, right? A systems level, the world, right? I'm talking about geopolitical systems. I'm talking about economic systems. I'm talking about environmental systems. You cannot go into the lab and design a chemical and say, I'm doing it in a beaker and that's all I need to worry about, right? You need to think about what you're doing from a systems perspective. All of those materials have a history. They come from a certain place and they have a certain supply chain associated with them. They don't come, although you may buy them cheaply, that doesn't mean that they don't have human, environmental, social and economic issues associated with them, right? So we need, when we're thinking about green and sustainable chemistry, and we're thinking about pharma, you say pharma, we're making drugs, we're making things that make people live healthier, better lives. And what I would say is we need to begin to think about doing that in a way that doesn't have all these attendant issues associated with it. The second point of the slide is about efficiency. And many people say, oh, I just need to do what I do more efficiently. And what efficiency invariably leads to is that you use more of something. That's what Jevons paradox tells us. That is that if I can do something really efficiently, so think about uh, communication and cell phones and the proliferation of cell phones. Communication became more efficient because of cell phones. Did this use of cell phones increase or decrease? It increased. What are the attendant problems with cell phones? Well, they have 64 elements. Many of the ones that I said are highly stressed. It gives you an example of the problem of Jevons paradox. We need to not just focus on being more efficient at something, but in using less to produce the same thing we're trying to produce. These are my choices about why we need, or things we need to think about. So greater chemical diversity, I'll talk more about that. Greater uptake of synthetic biology. Chemists need to become better at recognizing how to do molecular transformations using enzymes and that sort of thing. Biologically derived molecules as feedstocks, lower energy conversion of CO2 and into other useful chemical building blocks. Hydrogen is required for everything that we do in chemistry. And the way in which hydrogen is produced nowadays is through steam reforming of methane. And for every molecule of H2 that we produce 2 molecules of CO2. So again, that's an unsustainable way of delivering hydrogen. This is why it's so important that we come up with more sustainable routes to hydrogen. And finally, we need to get more used to and understand how we can become a circular economy. So these are the problems that we have in the batch chemical operation. And again, pharma is all about batch chemical operations. Only recently are they exploring and beginning to use flow processes at a very low scale. And that's, you'll see more of that for a variety of reasons, but that's the kind of thing we need to do. But the point of this slide is that there's a tremendous number of challenges facing us in making a transition from where we are to where we need to be. Don't underestimate the issues of economic and financial issues, the startup and the in-ground capital. So you're not going to replace a multi-purpose chemical plant, batch chemical operation overnight. There's a tremendous amount of money and investment, and the way that drug substances are going, the margins at which you can operate are shrinking. This is a huge problem in India, in the pharmaceutical India, in the contract manufacturing part of pharma in India, particularly for drugs associated with generics. Their margins are shrinking. They can't recapitalize. So the transition to a new way of making drugs is very difficult. But I would argue that the bigger issue is around educational systems and the fact that we are not teaching students how to do chemistry in a different way. And the second biggest issue is that we have an inherent aversion to change. We're very risk averse. This kind of change looks scary to people because it's not something that they know and are comfortable with. So the current process development is difficult in pharma. Large portfolios, that means that you have 10,000 candidates for every one that makes it to the market, right? Big portfolio. Significant route modifications throughout the entire development, incremental optimization of chemical processes. Process chemists are very good at highlighting problems and working them out and optimizing the process. And there's this focus on yield, quality, and cost of goods. Those are really not great measures of greenness and sustainability. I would talk more about that if I had time. Number of steps is probably the best measure in this group of measures for greenness and sustainable. The fewer number of steps, the better. Chemists, as you are trained, use chemistries that you shouldn't use. And in most cases, the chemistries that you are trained to use cannot be used in industry. And if you look at all of the named reactions, chemistry operates on precedent. We go into SciFinder or to Reaxys, we identify a set of reactions, we try those reactions, we do substrate scoping. All of those kinds of chemistries, one, are based on petrochemical framework molecules. They're based on CH activation and related types of chemistries. And those kinds of chemistries don't work when you have a biological molecule which is highly functionalized with oxygen and nitrogen, and you have to do a chemical transformation on that molecule. It doesn't work. The point is that we need to come up with a different palette of chemistries to manage this transition to a different set of building blocks or framework molecules. There is a perception that you always need to create new reactions. And in pharma, what we discovered is that 80+% of the reactions that are done in any given time can fall into certain categories. And this was done in 2004 and 2005 and repeated multiple times since then. It changes slightly depending on the types of molecules that you're working with, but these are the set of reactions. It's a very reduced set of reactions. So the point is that when you start acting as though you need new reactions, and that's really where the excitement is, in reality, it's not. It's really finding a set of reactions that work. It's like a can opener, you can go to, it will always work, it's robust. That's what we need, but we need it for a different set of molecules. Roundtable identified. They did it in 2007 and again published a revised version of this in 2016. And these are the kinds of things that the world needs to focus on, right? Less use of those precious metals, better catalysis for amided peptide formation. So peptide in particular, peptides and oligonucleotides are like 9 of the top 10 drugs on the market in the world today. And peptide and oligonucleotide chemistry is the least green or sustainable chemistry, bar none. It's horrible. You have process mass intensities on the order of 10 to 20,000 kilos of material to make 1 kilo of drug substance. And that's for a standard small molecule. On average, it's something like 100 kilos per kilo. So this is a long list. I won't go down each one of them, but you get the idea. There are some key challenges that the industry is facing in terms of finding replacements for these kinds of chemistries or these kinds of solvents. Lest you think that engineering doesn't have a role to play, and if you look at that and say, gee, engineering is so far ahead of chemistry, it's really not. All of the basic types of ways in which we provide reaction spaces for chemistry have been around effectively forever. We use what we use because they work thermodynamically, they're kinetically favorable, high yields, predictability. Don't ever underestimate predictability and its importance in our lives and in the life of a chemist. Easily obtained, that means low cost. So again, many of the pharma companies are now focusing on everything from a commodity chemical. So this is, pennies for a kilo of material. And that's a huge challenge because again, you build a tremendous amount of chemical complexity into the molecules starting from a common commodity chemical. And generally, chemists aren't trained to work in flow. We don't use photolysis and electrolysis, electrochemical type of reactions as much as we do. And so I would argue that those kinds of technologies need to be utilized because they're more efficient typically. And we have all these risks associated with the things that we do. I've talked about many of these, but virtually everything that you do typically is done in a hood. And that means that if you scale that, you've got all these problems within the company and outside of the company. So let's think about this, about designing new chemicals or materials. Are you thinking about EHS and sustainability in your research? Are you thinking about the particular structural features and the hazards that they will impart to the material that you're making? This is the biggest problem in pharma, bar none, right? Is the safety. You have to come up with a molecule that is safe for human consumption. And how they will interact with living systems. So one of the things you know, if you spend any time with toxicologists, is virtually every chemical, pretty much every chemical in some way interacts with physiology. And so, you've got this point where there is actually a physiological response that may not be observable, but there is a response. And that's something that you always need to keep in mind. Chemicals have impacts. The magnitude of challenge is quite large on a world scale. There's lots of new chemical entities discovered, and people attempt to bring them to market. If you look at bioactive chemicals like pharmaceuticals and crop protection, it takes years and millions to billions of dollars to bring those drugs to market. And it's a huge challenge to do that in a green and sustainable way. So the only way we're going to do that, as I mentioned very early in my talk, is if everybody focuses on design. So from first principles, when you sit down to conceive of a molecule, you need to be thinking about all of these issues in how you design your chemical transformations, the routes that you take, how they are going to be made, and the impacts that happen outside the immediate system of your environment, your laboratory environment. We could talk about these various things, but we like to recognize well-designed products. Right? The everything from aeronautics to buildings to, the cell phones. We have a love affair, but I would argue that we're not quite thinking about chemistry the same way that we think about the products that we use every day. And this unfortunate consequence is that, waste is a design failure. Waste happens because people aren't thinking about using things as best in the best manner that they possibly can. So again, we need to build sustainability, greenness, and functionality and performance in through the design of what we do. And we need, again, to focus on doing this in a way which designs out potential sustainability issues. So as I said, I spent 28 years in industry, so I understand the demands that are there. I mentioned in pharma, 10,000 in one end, one out the other end. That's a tremendous amount of attrition that happens. There's this focus on speed to market. The first drug to market for a particular indication, right, or to solve an unmet need, is going to be the most profitable. So there's always a desire to get to market as rapidly as possible. The only way we can battle these two things is to, and to meet our sustainability issues, is to do it very early in design. So in education, we have been working on the implementation of some educational materials, resources that build up core competencies in chemistry or chemistry students. So helping graduates understand how to design and select chemicals from this systems and green and sustainable chemistry perspective. We need to do the same thing in terms of the chemical routes that they choose, the synthetic routes. And we need to do it, have them more product focused. And by product, as pharmacy students, you're focusing on the chemical entity or the drug substance, the active pharmaceutical ingredient. There invariably a formulation associated with it, a delivery method, and a whole supply chain before you make that, and a supply chain to the consumer. And then drugs get excreted. And so we need to think more about the end of life. What happens after a drug is excreted. Many people have this false notion that all the drug is metabolized. And if you know anything about drugs, you know that the bioavailability is a huge issue in metabolism. You know, you might get 10% or so of the material being metabolized. Drugs generally are like bricks. They don't metabolize well. Chemical space available to chemists is quite large, 10 to the 60, almost Avogadro's number. It's a huge amount of opportunity to innovate in. This is the number of molecules discovered. Big difference between 10 to the 60 and 10 to the 8th. This is the number that's commercially available, 10 to the 7th. This is the number that is on the radar of the US EPA in terms of what's routinely used in commercial production. So think about this for a minute, 10 to the 60 versus 40,000. We're not, as chemists, even beginning to touch the surface of what's possible in terms of our molecular design. The major focus of green sustainable chemistry historically has been about the elimination and use of toxic materials and the reduction of waste. And what I'm hoping I'm getting you to see is that you need to broaden the aperture beyond these two things. We want molecules that have performance that is better or, at a very minimum equal to what we have now, and all these other things we don't want to have associated with our materials. And you'd say, oh, are these drugs well designed? I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but these are materials that are used routinely in the world. These are examples of persistent organic pollutants that are still used to some extent, particularly in the developing world, less so in most of the rest of the world. The only way we're going to get away from those kinds of molecules is if we innovate. And the market to do things greener is increasing exponentially. Green chemistry, if you read the early stuff that was written about it, was always about innovation. In other words, we can't solve today's problems with yesterday's solutions. We need to innovate our way out of this. So all the stuff I was talking about in terms of new chemicals, new chemistries, that all implies an excessive amount of innovation. And innovation, but it's not innovation for the sake of innovation. It's innovation to meet, societal needs, to not destroy the environment, and things ultimately we won't succeed unless they're economically viable. Innovations are required virtually everywhere, from the laboratory through business processes, through investment. Chemists need to talk more to engineers, so on and so forth. The point being is that to become more sustainable, become greener, we need to innovate everywhere. Building blocks, like I said before, if you look at the chemical diversity that is in biological molecules, there's a tremendous amount, but we aren't harnessing that chemical diversity. And as I mentioned before, 70% of the core organic transformations, this is outside, this is all of chemistry, 70% of those that are considered core or value-added transformations are based on high volume petroleum precursors from that slide I showed you at the very beginning. We can't continue that way. We need to be able to harness the molecules and the molecular structures that you see here. This was from a Department of Energy study back in 2007 that was done, and they came up with these framework molecules. And if you read the report, it's hundreds of pages long, but they showed all the different kinds of chemical transformations that using this set of framework molecules would buy you. Now compare this set of framework molecules with a set of framework molecules that I showed you at petroleum. Again, chemical oxidation state of carbon, or the oxidation state of carbon in those molecules of petroleum molecules relative to this, they're highly reduced. These are highly oxygenated, right? Completely different approach in terms of how we approach it synthetically, right? Look at the chemical diversity in these kinds of molecules, from oils to proteins. And, there's a lot of interesting structures, but again, we don't use them as chemists. And we need, again, to think about how we can transition from this tremendous molecular diversity in living systems, what they can make, harnessing the few and going into the applications that we require. So this is going to push us towards things called elite molecules. And that only means you have to move things around here. But if you look at this molecule in the upper right-hand corner of the perones, this becomes a molecule that synthetically looks interesting, right? It's something you can do a lot with, whereas something like glucose you can't. So the question is, how can we go through chemical transformations in a green, sustainable way to get to things that provide a synthetically useful chemical framework? And here's an example of a few molecules where, working from a single framework molecule, you can think about high value and commodity chemicals. Again, not going to spend a lot of time, but this is the mental transformation that needs to happen within academia and within industry to begin to say, okay, what can I do in a different way and still be successful at delivering the molecules that I need to deliver? You're used to thinking about privileged structures or elite molecules in drug substances, right? The big difference here is that instead of oxygen molecules, you have nitrogen molecules, which is a challenge to convert those oxygenated molecules into something nitrogen, or to use oxygenated molecules instead of nitrogen or sulfur or whatever it happens to be. So again, this idea of elite or privileged molecules shouldn't be a new one in terms of thinking about synthetic directions. And again, we want things to be done biologically, so we need more synthetic biology because frankly, it's a lot more efficient in many ways, particularly in chiral synthesis, asymmetric chiral synthesis. You can do with an enzyme far more productively and efficiently than you can do with many forms of organometallic chemistry, and you don't have all of the attendant sustainability issues of many of these organometallics, which rely on ruthenium and platinum and iridium to do the kinds of coupling transformations that I know you are probably using if you're doing synthetic roots design in pharmacy. So I hope that I've made the case that chemists and chemical engineering communities can make a profound difference in terms of the sustainability of the world. I hope that I've showed you that sustainable green chemistry is more than just hazard and waste reduction. It's far greater. It's more profound. Innovation is key to everything that we do. Early design is essential if we're going to make this transition. There's a lot going on in this space, but a lot more needs to be happening. As the patent literature showed, we need to have this translation from academia into industrial practice, and that really needs to be accelerated. It really is unacceptable that only 1 to 1.5% over 30 years of patents have a green sustainable chemistry element associated with them. And finally, there are a lot of tools available. Unfortunately, not many people are aware of them. I would invite you to go to the ACS-GCI Pharmaceutical Roundtable, so acsgcipr.org. It's a portal. There are many tools there for solvent selection, for process mass intensity calculations, for how to do med chem tips and tricks and things like that. So there's a lot of tools like that available to you, and I encourage you to go there and use them. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your kind attention. I've spoken a little bit longer than I wanted to, but I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. And also a shameless pitch for our conference. It will be a virtual conference this year in June. Again, the abstracts are open, but we had a very exciting conference last year. We had over 5,000 people participate, largely because it was free. It is for a fee this year, but it's very nominal. And it was really a great conference. So hopefully you'll be able to take part in that. Any questions?
Hello, sir.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. David. It was a great session. And we have definitely realized that green chemistry is not just about conservation and reducing the waste, but
I'm
also
afraid I'm not hearing
it is
any
more
questions.
profound.
Let me see if there's anything in the chat.
Yes, sir. Some
Uh,
questions have been posted in the chat.
All right, sorry, I do see the chat as you mentioned in your slide. Okay, so the difference between environmental and green chemistry. Environmental chemistry is, in my mind, largely chemistry that happens in the environment. So for example, understanding the mechanism behind ozone depletion, or photochemical ozone creation potential, or ocean acidification, or things like that. Green and sustainable chemistry is really about making chemicals in a different way, and doing it in a way that doesn't result in those environmental impacts. So again, that's really a difference. The other aspect of environmental chemistry is what's known as environmental fate and effects. So fate is when a chemical enters the environment, where does it go? Does it go into water, land, or sediment, or into the air? And effects are, what are the effects? So as I mentioned, most chemicals at some level have effects to environment, organisms in the environment, plants and animals, or microscopic organisms, and also people. So environmental chemistry is really thinking about the fate and effects of chemicals in the environment and all of the chemical mechanisms that occur in the environment. So hopefully that answers that question. There is no alternative to indium that I'm aware of. Even if you talk about organic light emitting diodes and, for TVs and stuff, or touch screens, indium is still an element for it. So that is an enormous challenge, chemistry challenge, to think about either how we can recycle and get away from entropic distribution, or how we can come up with a replacement that works as well as indium. And how can we replace precious metals like platinum and gold as catalysts? Enzymes. enzymes. The best way to get rid of platinum group metals is to focus on the use of enzymes. The pharma industry, companies are increasingly doing multi-step synthesis using enzymes. And that is really the way of the future. So life cycle assessment is in fact carried out. It is not carried out to the extent in every company. So for example, there are certain companies like BASF and Dow and some of the other big ones that do life cycle. They have in-house expertise and they do it routinely, and they use it to guide their portfolios and their products. But all of the small to medium-sized enterprises do not. The pharma industry is beginning to use it more. And that's why, frankly, it's moving away from, heavy dependence on solvents, or thinking about solvents. It's also why they are trying to move away from precious metal catalysis and looking at earth abundant catalysis. So I didn't mention earth abundant catalysis like iron and nickel. and cobalt and elements like that, that is very problematic. Most of the catalysts that rely on those metals, as you probably know, don't do well in air, and they have some real issues. They also have some issues in terms of residual in the drug substance, and it's very difficult to remove that. So that really, base metal catalysis is not the panacea that it once was thought about. So again, it's all about enzymes. And I guess we're at the top of the hour. So thank you again for your kind attention, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you so much. Yes, Sakshi, go on.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, sir, for answering all the questions. It was indeed an amazing session. Now, I would like to invite our Secretary, Soham Mohare, to propose the vote of thanks.
Good evening, everybody. I am Soham Mohare, Secretary for the ACS Bombay College of Pharmacy's Student Chapter, and it is my honor and pleasure to give the vote of thanks today. Truly, it was a very engaging webinar on green and sustainable chemistry, and I'm sure we all have gained some deep insights in sustainable design. I would like to thank our speaker for today, Dr. David Constable, the Science Director for the American Chemical Society's Green Chemistry Institute. Thank you for your wonderful insights on this topic, a topic which is very much important in the current scenario. And thank you for giving such wonderful answers to the questions asked and taking time off of the busy schedule to come here and give this presentation today. I would like to thank our faculty advisor, Dr. Krishna Iyer, our faculty co-advisors, Dr. Sagar Patel and Dr. Elvis Martis, and the whole ACS-BCP team for organizing and managing today's webinar. I would like to thank every faculty member for taking time after the busy schedule and attending this webinar. And I would also like to thank the postgraduate, undergraduate, and the PhD students from across the country who have attended this event and have engaged in it with such great interest. Now, we have posted the link for the feedback form in the chat box, so please fill it as soon as possible. And lastly, I would like to request everyone to switch on their videos for us to take a screenshot of today's participants.
Ayush, once you're done, you can tell us.
Yes, we are done.
Thanks a lot, everyone, for joining us today. You may leave the meeting.